The Behemoth Brewing Company presents the Department of Conversation with Pat Brittenden. Behemoth, give me something hoppy.
Thank you for joining me, David Goldberger, lawyer, professor, and as I understand, a classmate of one of New Zealand's former Prime Minister, Geoffrey Palmer, at law school.
Yes, indeed.
That
guy.
So that was in the late 60s, yeah? You were at law school with Geoffrey Palmer?
Yes.
Silly
Yes,
question.
so
Silly question, because I'm sure you're at law school with hundreds of people, but did you ever stay in touch? Did you ever connect with him post your university days?
I think we touched bases at a reunion, at a class reunion, our 50th or something like that. I haven't stayed in touch with him, and maybe some previous reunions. But when we were classmates, I had him. He and his wife and his child, at least, to my parents' house for Passover meal. I said, well, let's give him an opportunity to see what it's like in America in a Jewish household.
That's very cool. So that sounds like a fairly close connection at that age, to have someone around for a special meal like that.
But we were friendly in law school, and I regard him as a friend. Although at this point, because of the distance, we really hadn't kept touch.
And obviously, he rose to certain international prominence with being Prime Minister of New Zealand, and sounds like you had a good group of people. I'm talking to you, and we're talking about Geoffrey, and two people who have done very well with their careers. It must have been a good crew, a good group of people going through university at that time.
No question about it, and quite a politically diverse group. One of them became a senator, a United States senator. The other one became a member of the political underground known as the Weathermen during the Vietnam War period, and almost went to jail. It was a very interesting class.
Wow. Well, look, thank you for joining me. It's a cold winter's morning here in Dunedin in New Zealand, and I've got you sort of mid-afternoon in Virginia, Maryland, isn't it? Not Virginia, Maryland.
It's Maryland, and it's 90 plus here.
Oh, nice. Which is New Zealand numbers like early 30s Celsius. Yeah. It's probably 4 degrees Celsius here in New Zealand, which would be about 35 Fahrenheit.
Wish I could bottle it and send some of this to you. We're hating it.
Hey, I read of you on the internet recently, based around an award you got in 2017 from the ACLU. Interesting that it's made news recently, which I want to get into, and want to get into the award you got and who gave it to you, which is the ACLU. You're probably best known, and I've listened to a couple of podcasts with you on it and done a lot of reading, for a case in the 1970s where you just defended the free speech of some Nazis in a place called Skokie in America, their right to share their views. A free speech situation where even if the view is abhorrent, and obviously for yourself and for all of us, but for yourself with someone of Jewish ancestry, then it's almost the most offensive. But you were someone who came out of law school, went to the ACLU, and at some stage through that process, rose to the heights of, I want to say, had believed so much in free speech that you would defend the most abhorrent views. You would defend the right for someone to share publicly the most abhorrent views. So I really wanted to talk to you about free speech. I really wanted to talk to you about what that means. We're going through a consultation period here in New Zealand based on some ideas put out there by a Royal Commission after our horrific Christchurch Massacre a few years back about restrictions around speech. So that's sort of the genesis of this conversation. But I guess, first of all, is there anything in that very clunky synopsis I just gave you which you need to correct? Have I said anything wrong in all of that?
No, basically everything you've said is on the money.
I was wondering then if you could tell us, because you went from law school to the ACLU. Now, we hear that term a lot, but not being in America, could you just explain exactly what the ACLU is?
The ACLU, or American Civil Liberties Union, is a group that defends the civil liberties of its clients and defends civil liberties generally in the United States, and has been quite successful over the years in doing so. And by civil liberties, I mean the range of constitutional rights, for the most part, constitutional rights that appear in the Bill of Rights that are in the United States Constitution. One of its primary tasks and one of its primary reasons for existing has been defense of freedom of speech. It has, but it's, if there is a civil rights or civil liberties issue, the ACLU has had a hand in it. Now, I distinguish between civil rights and civil liberties because civil rights basically is an equality-oriented defense of the rights of individuals, generally concerns about discrimination and oppression of minority groups and well, women, majority group, but still people that generally regarded as underdogs. Civil liberties has a somewhat different spin because basically it doesn't look at the client, the identity of the client, and its concern is for the right as opposed to the particular profile of the individual whose rights are being denied. You'd never see, for example, a civil rights organization defending a Nazi or the right of a Nazi to speak, where a civil liberties organization would.
So it sounds like what you're saying is the ACLU sort of took cases based on the purity of free speech without prejudice. It doesn't matter really what the speech is. It was the ability or the constitutional right to share those views. Yes,
and the theory is if you can abridge the constitutional rights of one, then you can abridge the constitutional rights of others and perhaps everyone. So that what's sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, to put it in kind of colloquial terms.
I was having a conversation on my Facebook page last night, very briefly, before I went to bed, and then, of course, as often happens, the algorithm kicked in and some people started responding to it, and I had a late night talking on my Facebook page. But one of the points I made on that, and I think this speaks to, a Jewish man defending Nazis, or defending the right of Nazis to speak, is that we don't need freedom of speech for speech we all like. Freedom of speech seems to be only for abhorrent speech, because if everyone likes your speech, no one's got a problem with it. Would that be true?
That really has been the trademark of oppression of speech throughout the world. When the powers that be like it, and when the general public likes it, they leave it alone, and we never hear about it, or at least we never hear about people being prosecuted by the police or by the state, as opposed to unpopular speech, by whatever definition of popular is in each country. Of course, that's when you need protections, and you don't need them otherwise.
Yeah, so we're going through this consultation process at the moment, and people on my who have contacted me over the last 24 hours have said, I may be getting a little bit ahead of myself, and they might be right, but I also know that these processes happen very quickly, and then all of a sudden there's laws in place. So I want to have some of these conversations before they happen, because, as a former talkback host and as someone who I guess would like to say I sort of talk and offer opinions for a living, unpopular speech is sort of it's sort of the bastion of this world. Unpopular speech is necessary sometimes to get other speech flowing as well.
Well, you can't have a fully informed electorate, you can't have a fully informed citizenry if you don't allow unpopular speech, because otherwise you end up with a sanitized public discourse, and that leads nowhere.
I'd like to have a chat quickly about what happened at the ACLU in 2017. I'm also quite interested as to why this has come up now. So the New York Times, and I'll bring up, for people who are watching this, I'll bring up some footage here. The New York Times ran an article titled "Once a Bastion of Free Speech, the ACLU Faces an Identity Crisis." Now, this was its introduction says an organisation that has defended the First Amendment rights of the Nazis and the Ku Klux Klan is split by an internal debate over whether supporting progressive causes is more important. Now, as we talked about before, you were saying, or I said, and you concurred, that ACLU is without prejudice. It really is about the purity of the free speech law. But this is a quote from you within this article based on this award you received from the ACLU and sitting in the, I guess, the award ceremony, hearing speech after speech. You said this: "I got the sense it was more important for the ACLU staff to identify with clients and progressive causes than to stand on principle. Liberals are leaving the First Amendment behind." Obviously, we are talking in America, but I listen to a lot of podcasts, I listen to a lot of commentary, and it seems that it's not an uncommon thought that the once, I guess you might even say the once bastion of free speech would be the left, is now the people who are running furthest away from it.
Well, I don't know whether they're running furthest away from it, but clearly folks to the left of, many folks to the left of center have become very uncomfortable with freedom of speech because it, in their view, it helps people in power, and helping people in power is helping the oppressor. And I think it's a generalization that, or maybe better said, a viewpoint that really, first of all, misunderstands what's going to unfold if you take the position that there should only be speech for some, free speech for some. And it's a political rather than principled reaction to what rights are and what rights should be.
Listening to a podcast that you were on, you also said, and I think this sort of talks to the idea of who is fighting back against free speech. You said this, quote, "Watching the intolerance of the progressive left right now, which parallels the intolerance of the far right." So it seems that perhaps the progressive left right now, who are putting their hands up to be, the people who are bringing change for good to the world, maybe the styles that they're using it aren't that different from the people they oppose on the far right.
That absolutely is the case. And if you look at the countries that have moved way to the far left in history, and I'm talking about Russia and the USSR and China, who frame themselves as communists, or at least, or did, and with respect to Russia. It's hard to think of another political ideology that has been more identified with the far left. Yet it is an ideology we also associate with repression of speech and dissent, so that the right has had no monopoly on repression of speech.
I love American politics. I love watching American politics. I keep a very close eye on it. It's on in my house all the time when I'm working. CNN's often on in the background, or an independent news media outlet off the internet. And I wonder if the progressive left, maybe running from freedom of speech, my words, not yours, or those concepts, is because it seems that they're maybe fighting for civil causes rather than fighting against the government. A lot of the causes of the left at the moment are about people's rights, and if they allow, people to offer a contrary opinion, then the progressive left is saying, well, you don't want these people to have their rights. Whereas if you thought about it as in offering opinions against the government, they might have a different position. Or maybe that's what the right is. The right runs away from it because they don't want dissent in another area. So they're both saying, we don't want dissent in this area that we're passionate about, and if you do dissent, it's hate speech. But the areas they're passionate about are completely different.
There's a lot to what you're saying. I would frame it a little bit differently. It seems to me that I can't speak for the right. I do not identify with the right, and so it's a little harder for me to say that, make this generalization, although I suspect it's true on both ends of the spectrum, is that the people who are being asked to stand up for the rights of unpopular folks and so forth find themselves identifying or wanting to identify with their clients. And once you start to identify with your clients and say, I belong with that group, you become an advocate for that group rather than someone who stands back and then and says, these rights are very important and they're critical to the democracy, as opposed to saying this right is critical to the group that I'm representing. And that was my criticism of the ACLU, is that I think it's drifting toward representing groups that it likes and feels empathy with or sorry for, without taking the step back and saying, well, there are other groups that are getting their rights abridged. And if those rights are abridged, ultimately it's going to affect everybody. I think that's getting lost in the discussion.
So therefore, would the ACLU today defend someone who was pro-Trump, for example?
I think so, because being pro-Trump is not the same as being a Nazi, for example, nor is it the same as being a Klansman. It's when you start to get into the hard fringes, which are the groups of people on that frequently raise the most important individual rights issues and the most difficult individual rights issues. That's when they flinch. And frankly, I think that if you look at the preferences of the group people, if you look at the preferences of people making the case intake decisions, they might on occasion say, or may too frequently say, well, we only have limited resources, so this Trump guy is getting his rights abridged, but we really have a higher priority over here with this guy that we like. And that's what I'm afraid is going on.
Do you think, looking at the world today, and I'd be happy to hear perspective historically as well, is there one side of the political spectrum, left or right, that sort of has more quote-unquote cases to be made by the ACLU? Like, is it more likely that freedom of speech is being squashed on the left or the right? And if that was the case, does that therefore mean on the left is where freedom of speech cases are being squashed more, so of course there's going to be more representation of the left in the ACLU?
Well, I think that's probably been the case in the States for a long time. But if you start to stay away from cases because of the identity of the client, the fact that the client happens to be on the right or be on the extreme right, ultra radical right, then you're talking about cases which are going to generate principles and outcomes that affect everybody across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And I think that's getting lost.
Yeah. So what you're saying, to be clear, is that far right group getting a case for their freedom of speech is going to help that far left group when they need their freedom of speech protected as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, now look, I defended the Nazis in Skokie, or the right of them to have their, the right to freedom of speech in Skokie. And so I'm biased because I suffered through it, and I still believe I did the right thing. So you could say, well, I've got horse blinders on. Mm-hmm. But it seemed to me that it turned out to be an extraordinarily effective lesson for everyone across all political views, across the entire political spectrum, about the importance of freedom of speech. And I think that it had overall, in spite of the fact that it benefited a bunch of Nazis, it benefited the entire democratic process.
The idea of the ACLU being more ideological, if indeed they are. I have to say, when I visited their website looks like a very progressive website. I mean, if you have a look at what's on their front page right now, and look, let me just say, this is not a criticism. This is just an observation. The first banner is Black Lives Matter. The second banner is transgender rights. When you scroll down, it seems that most of their what they're putting out at the moment, fighting for trans rights. During the Trump administration, we filed 246 lawsuits. That looks like someone saying we're fighting the Trump administration. You know, fighting for LGBTQ families, securing abortion access for all, blocking construction of Trump's border wall. It has the appearance, and I said maybe completely legitimately, because they're all completely worthy of defending constitutionally, but it has the appearance of being incredibly left-wing. Not even like hiding it. It's like all of their cases they've put on their front page feel like they're progressive causes, which surprised me.
Well, I haven't spent time looking at I've retired from the ACLU quite a while ago. I haven't looked at the web pages recently. My concern is that what you're seeing is to a degree accurate, and that it is also true that a lot of the cases and causes that are being represented and show up on their web pages are important cases that need defense or that need advocacy, and the ACLU is well equipped to do it. What it's doing, however, I think, is trying to appeal to a constituency that has those political preferences.
Yeah.
And it's hiring staff people that have those political preferences. So I think the balance is shifting within the organization in terms of its priorities.
It seems what you're saying is a little bit what some commentators talk about when it comes to Fox News. The Fox News hosts don't necessarily get told unequivocally, you must put this opinion across. They just hire hosts already with that opinion. So that's right. How they forward their narrative. So they can legitimately say, we don't instruct our hosts to do anything or to say anything, but they hire hosts who they know have a political persuasion that's going to get them to say those things anyway. So they can wipe their hands and say, we're clean of that. But yeah, so they're putting the people in place to continue that narrative.
I'm not sure. I agree with what you've just said, but I'm not sure the ACLU has consciously done it in a kind of cynical way. The way that Fox News operates, is my understanding, is they even instruct their commentators and their broadcasters to address certain talking points each day, to make certain points and stress certain points. And I don't think that's happening at the ACLU.
Yeah, right.
I do think that the staff has not been able to separate its political leanings from the broader civil liberties agenda. And as a consequence, you're seeing them get all mixed up together. And therefore, it really looks like the organization is leaning left of center when it should try to be inclusive rather than exclusive.
Yeah, and I think, look, not to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but just looking back at the site, I don't know if you can see that on your smaller screen, but people watching this on the big screens can. They do talk about the history on the ACLU, and in 1978 they talk about your case in Skokie, and they talk about 1942, the internment of more than 110,000 Japanese concentration camps. So it's not like they're overtly saying we've never sort of represented views which the left oppose or whatever. But it seems that at the moment they're putting, at least let me put it this way, it looks like if that's their shop front, which is what a web page is these days, their shop front says go to the left, even if it's the background is not doing that.
That's what it looks to me like. And I wish it weren't true, because I think that being inclusive, that is having people from all places on the political spectrum be participants as well as clients and supporters, is really an important thing. On the Skokie case, I had lawyers working with me, thankfully volunteers, that because it became just an impossible in terms of the size. It really wasn't a case. It multiplied as time went on. But one of the people that was very helpful was a staunch conservative Republican libertarian. His firm told him, you can work with him on the case so long as you do not tell anybody and who that you're working on it, and so long as your name doesn't go on the papers. But every law firm in town felt that way because of the client. Nobody wanted their name on the papers. But it made me feel that the organization had the identity that it ought to have. I had a volunteer staff colleague at the time who became a very dear friend, who was a very deeply committed Catholic and would not take a salary, even though she had earned it at the ACLU, because the ACLU represented clients that challenge abortion laws. And she deplored the ACLU's position on abortion. She nonetheless agreed with it on First Amendment issues and criminal defense issues and the like. So she worked with us and was invaluable on the Skokie case. And that's the kind of organization that I think an ACLU needs to be. And I think, was it the Civil Liberties Committee in Europe? I'm drawing a blank on the name, but they operate the same way that the current ACLU seems to be operating, and that is that they seem to pick and choose clients based on their own political preferences.
Are you personally, and this is going to be a bit of a long question, so bear with me, but I'm wondering if you personally are getting any pushback from those who are now in the ACLU for your thoughts, especially once this article came out. And the reason I ask that, it seems that there is a generation coming through now who are fighting the fight of those before them, who are also kind of deriding those before them. An example is the kind of third wave feminism versus second wave feminism. Many third wave feminists look at people like Germaine Greer and Martina Navratilova and these people basically thinking they're I don't know, transphobes and whatever the words they use towards them, even though they won't acknowledge that they're standing on their shoulders. And we all know that idea of, if I've seen further, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, meaning the people who came after are standing on your shoulders. People at the ACLU are standing on your shoulders to see further. But it feels like there is a generational thing, and I'm not saying this of the ACLU, but I guess I am kind of saying it of that third wave versus second wave feminism. They're standing on their shoulders, but while they're standing on their shoulders, they're kind of crapping on their past a little bit. And I'm wondering if you've had any pushback, especially since that article came out from the ACLU or people in that world about what you've said to do with your concerns around the ACLU or anyone in that area.
Well, there's been pushback, but it's been pushed back to say that, he's wrong. The criticism that was in that article is wrong because look what we're doing. We're representing the NRA that's facing a suit by the state of New York to have it dissolved because there appears to have been hanky-panky with its funds by the staff and in violation of state charity laws, and that there's been lying and so forth by the organization. So the ACLU is, I assume, I've not looked at the papers, but it's saying that there's a First Amendment right of association, freedom of association, and dissolution is simply not the proper remedy. So that they're saying, look at that, that's what we're doing. But on the other hand, when the ACLU the ACLU is it's a complicated organization. Each state of the 50 states has its own state ACLU, or almost all the states do. And the state of Virginia ACLU represented the white nationalists in Charlottesville. And that's what really caused the blowback. And it was just shortly before I got that award. And the staff, to put it bluntly, raised hell. At least a significant number of the staff raised hell about, I shouldn't say the whole staff, it may have been a very articulate minority, but not an insubstantial minority, that ACLU shouldn't be representing those kinds of clients, that it shouldn't have been representing the white nationalists in Charlottesville. And it gets more and more ideological and less principled, in my view, when you start to talk like that.
Yeah, it also makes me think as well, and I don't know the situation behind all that, obviously, but sometimes organizations, groups grab onto one or two things of the past or of the present to justify the 20 or 30 other things they're doing that contradict that. It's a little bit like the GOP still claims to be the party of Lincoln, you know, the man who freed the slaves, and you'd see
Right.
their modern principles these days reflect nothing to do with, you know, freeing the slaves, but they still claim that title.
Absolutely. And I think that, I just don't know where the ACLU and organizations will end up, as this process proceeds, whether it's going to maintain its identity as a civil liberties organization or whether it's going to become a progressive political organization. I just have no clue, and I will weep if it ends up as a progressive political organization.
And hopefully Skokie won't become their Lincoln. No, we're the group that defended the Nazis in the 1970s, even though their ideology has changed somewhat, but they use that as their calling card, like we are the party of Lincoln, so to speak.
I know there's some other former staff members of, let's say, similar vintage to mine, who view that as exactly what's going on.
Right.
That one of them, who will remain unnamed because he's so prominent, said to me that he felt that they mouthed one thing and did another, or at least that some of the staff members mouthed one thing and did another.
It also seems interesting that you say they've pushed back on your perspective from that article, because it seems in that article you were just saying what you heard at the dinner. You kind of mentioned the speeches that you heard. So it seems problematic to be pushing back on what you heard them say at the dinner. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I did. But in fairness, when I talked to the Times reporter, I was talking more generally. It wasn't just at the dinner. I was aware of the blowback over the representation of the white nationalists in Charlottesville. I was aware of the fact that there had been some advertising, for example, on behalf of what appeared to be in support of a progressive candidate for governor in the state of Georgia.
Wow.
And I had also been talking to some staff members. I'm going to, people who at the time of all of this, and shortly before, some of whom are now former staff members, someone who remains a staff member elsewhere in the country outside of the national organization, who were telling me that this is exactly what's going on. So that it's not just simply my reaction at listening at lunch and getting that funny feeling in the pit of my stomach.
I'm interested about the idea of hate speech in general. I think most of us would agree, and I'm sure you agree, I mean, the old adage of you can't yell fire in a theatre, that there is going to be some restrictions on speech, which then bodes the question, where are those restrictions and who decides? I mean, my big concern about the process happening in New Zealand at the moment, albeit still ongoing, and we'll see what happens when it comes out, is who gets to decide what is hate speech? Who decides what can and can't be said? Who decides what's criminal? I mean, assuming that you say that there needs to be some restrictions on speech. And I mean, in America, often when people say to me, this is the land of the free and we have free speech, I say, really, why don't you go and threaten the president? See how free your speech is there. There are some restrictions in places. What do you think about the idea of any restrictions, and how do you decide where to draw that line, in your opinion?
Well, my view is that hate speech in general, almost universally, ought to be on the side of the line that would divide protected speech from unprotected speech. It should be on the protected speech side. That that I can't think of any hate speech per se, now looking at the words nakedly on the page, that you can justify suppressing. It's only when you can connect that speech with action in the form of incitement or some kind of action which has an effect which is damaging, provable, palpable, and a clear result of the articulation of those words. If not, I think it should be left alone. You hold your nose.
And one of the problems with what you've just said, not that you've said it, but with that concept, which I agree with, is there is a growing movement, especially on the progressive left at the moment, that says speech is violence. There is this idea that some people are trying to get this idea through, that your speech is an act of violence. Therefore, if we kind of agree that when your speech leads to incitement of violence being something that is problematic, if speech is being defined as violence, then that just opens up a whole can of worms.
Well, I'm not sure we want to go down this rabbit hole completely, but in my view, what's happened is basically legal or rhetorical advocacy, in the sense that at least in the States, it has been recognized that unless you can link speech with a palpable harm, observable, provable harm, that it's protected. And getting your feelings hurt or being offended or being shocked when it's not directed at you one-on-one is not the kind of harm that American law recognizes. So that what's happened is that the folks finally figured that out, and now they're changing the labels of the things that they have to argue. It happened back in the obscenity area, where in our courts in the States, the definition of what was legally obscene, sexually explicit material, is very narrow. So what the opponents of obscenity, particularly the feminists, began to do is say, well, obscenity is the equivalent of violence against women. So what they did was basically say, well, we've got to prove some palpable harm, some physical violence, some physical observable phenomenon. So let's call it, the speech itself, violence. Let's call it discrimination per se. And then we maybe we can gloss over the fact that really it isn't the palpable harm that the law ordinarily punishes or authorizes the punishment of. So I think it's been, frankly, I'm maybe more cynical than most. I think it's a shell game.
Right. Well, I mean, and that kind of marries up against something I was going to say earlier, which was one of the things that people have to be aware of when you are supporting perhaps I was going to say a more draconian law around hate speech, is that one man's hate speech is another man's freedom. But it's a little bit like, that saying, every cloud has a silver lining. People say that, but they never say the reverse, which is also true. Every silver lining has a cloud. It's like if my free speech is your hate speech, there's probably going to be a time where the opposite also applies as well. And something,
absolutely.
And that's I think what you were alluding to with when the defense of free speech for the far right group, the hypothetical far right group, and one day will be case law that can be used to defend a far left group, and that's the idea of it. I was having a conversation last night with someone, and I just had that thought about the poem "First They Came." They came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I wasn't a socialist.
I'm familiar with it.
Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to come to fight for me. And it also made me think about, I had a conversation with someone the other day. It wasn't about this, but it was about a group. And the group was quite internal looking. And I think what happens when you get a group that's internal looking is eventually, once they've they've exercised all their demons on the outside, like all the bad people, they start to look at their own stuff and pick holes in their own stuff. And my concern around this legislation is at some stage, it will go from, let's say the progressive left fighting for these laws because they want to be able to say hate speech to the right. That'll all be dealt with, quote unquote, dealt with. And then they'll start to turn inwardly, and there'll be some within their own group which won't be deemed virtuous enough, and they will be the victims of the hate speech. And you go.
You're describing the plot of Animal Farm, it seems to me.
True, yeah.
But the example of that I can think of offhand is that the idea that that obscenity was inherently discrimination against women. That formulation, which never caught on in the States, fortunately, in my view, because again, I explained it's kind of a shell game. We're now not going to say that it's so profoundly offensive that we can punish it, but now we're going to say it's discriminatory and therefore we can punish it. What happened was it did gain traction in Canada, where laws were passed, and the first people, and it was upheld by that approach, that analysis was upheld by the Canadian Supreme Court, and some of the first people to be prosecuted were gays for dissemination of obscene or sexually offensive and essentially sexually explicit gay literature. And it seemed to me that those were some of the people that theoretically were to be protected. So it absolutely did not carry the protection that I thought it was supposed to protect. Because when you're prosecuting gays for their obscenity, you're picking on them. You're picking on little people. You're not, in terms of their political power. You're not picking on these horrible male dominators who are trying to exploit women.
Yeah, and with that as well, I wonder about the consistency of how it's applied as well. And it seems we're growing up in a culture today. Growing up, you know what I mean? We're living in a culture today where consistency doesn't matter to a lot of people. This is not to do with freedom of speech, well, I don't think, but I noticed last week there was, Lin-Manuel Miranda, who was an unbelievably gifted, playwright and musician, and he obviously did Hamilton, and Hamilton was the most amazing thing anyone's ever seen, and he made all the Caucasian forefathers into minorities, and he was applauded for that, etc., etc., and he was like the darling of, well, everyone really, but the darling of the left, And then this movie comes out, In the Heights, about a Latino part of, I think it's New York, but it had the wrong Latinos playing the roles, and all of a sudden he was the enemy because he was being labeled a colorist. And it's that idea about people saying, well, these don't look like the people living in this part of town. And I get it, that's an okay thing, but those same people weren't saying those founding fathers don't look like the founding fathers that were there. They were happy to accept that those founding fathers didn't look like that. But then when the movie comes out, they weren't happy to accept that those people in that city didn't look like that. And it's this inconsistency which has gone from him being the darling of the left to him being derided as a quote-unquote colorist because the wrong Latinos were playing this part. And it concerns me again about what people will do when it comes to trying to, convict people of a hate crime based on an inconsistent society we live in today.
It's wholly, that goes back to, I think, your opening point. You're wholly at risk when you are using hate speech, for example, as a criteria, because at base, what you're doing is saying, this is offensive, this offends me, this offends my group. And as soon as offense becomes the criterion, the consequence is that, and it's a natural product in this debate and discussion, then you get colorism as and purity, frankly, ideological purity as a criteria, because people are offended their cohorts don't think the same way that they do and say things that they find offensive. And then they're saying, well, you're discriminating. Or the people in law enforcement, frankly, to be perfectly cynical about it, will say, well, what's going to get me the most applause in the marketplace? What's going to get me the most votes? Well, if I go after this group, they're not very popular and they're saying some pretty offensive things. Even if they're acquitted, heck, I'm still going to pick up votes in the long run. And I think that these offensive speech statutes are an invitation to politicians to abuse power.
Mm. The law in New Zealand, as I've said a couple of times, is being discussed at the moment. Discussion documents, people can make submissions, which is quite nice. So we have the opportunity to speak up. And I guess, I mean, I don't know if I'll make a submission, but the way I kind of like to talk things through is to do this sort of thing, where we're able to put information out there for people to think about when it comes to this law. Maybe this will inspire some other people to get involved in putting a submission in. Our Justice Minister was being interviewed, and he was being challenged over the catchment of people that may be in this proposed new law, albeit, again, we'll say the law is not in writing yet. And he made it very clear that the idea of the change for the law was, and this is a quote, about inciting hatred towards a group of people. So he was saying, if you want to say that an individual person is blah, 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 that's not under the law. But if it was going to incite hatred towards a group of people, that would come under the law. And the journalist in hand made all sorts of examples. She said things like, well, what if it was a millennial saying, all boomers are XYZ because of the housing market? And he kind of had to say that if it was inciting hatred towards all boomers, then that could come under the law. That scared me a lot, actually. And when the journalist, made the question about intent, and she said, who decides intent? And the response was, initially it's the police who decide intent. Again, that scared me. We're giving the ability for other people to tell us what our intention is with the speech we're using. Again, I'll say it again to be fair, not law yet, but this is the process we're going through. I'm wondering your thoughts around what you're hearing from me now.
Well, I'd be as worried as you are, because you can say, well, and the Justice Minister, I'm sure, would say, well, it really is, in the first instance, it's a police officer on the street that's making the decision based on his view of the intent or her view of the intent of the speaker. But it'll be fixed by the jury or the judge at trial, who's going to be an objective decision maker, and he'll hear all the evidence. Even putting a defendant who is completely innocent through the hell of a legal proceeding is a way to increase the cost of speech and increase the cost of controversial speech, simply because you're going to frighten people. It's going to have a chilling effect. What we're seeing in extreme cases right now is that's kind of the approach that the Chinese government is using in Hong Kong, and they're throwing, reporters in jail. And guy that, what did he do? And he's charged with a felony right now. He rode through downtown Hong Kong. As my understanding, he had a flag or banner on the back of his motorcycle that said "Free Hong Kong" or "Democratic Hong Kong," and that was all. And he was arrested and charged with a felony. And the simple answer is yes, that did offend the government, and yes, it does offend some patriotic Hong Kongers. But even if he's acquitted, the Chinese government knows to send a message to everybody else that you better not say those kinds of things, because we may do the same thing to you.
Yeah, I could imagine things like, talkback radio stations and that being more cautious, for example, with their speech, because they don't want to be dragged through the courts. They don't want to have a $100,000 bill to prove that their talkback host didn't break the law, let alone did. So that's what you're saying. Yeah. It's a restrictions on, people don't want to say things publicly in case they get in trouble, which is a very sad state of affairs.
Well, let me just say, though, that to argue the other side for just a second.
Yep.
Even though I'm not fully sympathetic to it. And that is the criteria in the documents, the International Covenant for Human Rights and the international, the international documents that govern the European Union, that incitement of hatred is, I think that's the phrase drawn from those documents. So that that's kind of a standard that exists in continental Europe, even though it's not always enforced in those terms. It's even the good guys have basically said inciting hatred is punished. Laws punishing incitement of hatred is okay. I mean, it's not okay, because what you're doing is punishing something very abstract in feelings. You're inciting hatred. You're making people feel bad or hate other people, not take action against them, not do anything. But it becomes very amorphous, and it's a way to shut down really aggressively radical speech of all kinds.
If you were to err on the side of not being able to prove or be 100% sure, would you always err on the side of they can't be held accountable? I'm actually thinking specifically about January the 6th in America. There was that rally at the Capitol building where people like Trump and people like Giuliani said things. But, you can also say, my husband is fighting cancer. Doesn't mean they're literally punching cancer. It means so there could be, in my opinion, I think there's enough unclearness. They didn't say go to the Capitol and kick the doors in. Would you be comfortable with some kind of laws that basically said, if I said go to the Capitol and kick the doors in, that's inciting violence? If I said we're fighting for our rights to survive, that wouldn't be? Like, there must be a demarcation line somewhere.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think the problem is that you have to take the entire context into account, and that's a factual question. Again, and in the States, it would be a factual question for the jury to decide that if A, B, C, and D are true, did that cause D to happen? And those are the kinds of decisions and kinds of questions that juries routinely decide in your country and in mine. I don't think you're going to be able to draw a clear and a bright line in the way that you're suggesting, on paper, that is just absolutely certain. We have a test in this country, and basically language that incites unlawful action under I'm not quoting the exact language. I'm kind of frankly, this is a kind of a free flowing discussion.
Sure.
And I would have had it in front of me if I had known it was going to be relevant. But essentially, if there's an incitement to violence under circumstances in which it is likely to occur, and Justice Douglas called it stealing or brigading people for action, so that there is a point where there's going to be a crossover into action. And I don't think you can necessarily identify the specific words and circumstances that are going to trigger it in the abstract so that you can put them in a statute.
Yeah.
That's why I think the justice minister may have you over, or folks of, and folks of that see things like you and I apparently do, over a barrel, because what they'll do is narrow it. And if they narrow it enough, then they may be able to comply at least with the European standard, clearly not with the American standard. The European standard, I suspect, applies in New Zealand. And we'd have to take a look at the specific case law on New Zealand, but it wouldn't surprise me if that were the case.
I requested some time with the minister to have a conversation before you and I connected, but it never went through, which is fine. Because there was a couple of other things that I'll just mention as we sort of get towards the end. And thank you again for giving us some time today. It's been amazing. The minister was challenged by the reporter about why, if this is such an important law, the sentencing for committing hate crime, hate speech is 3 months to 3 years, which is more than, for example, if you assault a child. And the minister basically said very, very correctly, and he was making sure he didn't want to minimise the assault on a child, but he said, and this is a quote, you could be talking thousands of people that may be offended and victims of that. So he was saying that rather than being an offence against one person being the child, it was an offence against thousands of people. But the thing that terrified me about that statement, and if I'm being really generous, I might say he misspoke, but I'm sure some people will have picked up on the phrase that I used there, offended. He said talking thousands of people that may be offended. And I thought, I'm almost prepared to give him graciously that he misspoke, because if we go down a path, if anyone goes down the path of hate speech being speech that offends someone, it feels like that's the end of modern civilization.
That goes absolutely without saying. I mean, when we're talking about incitement to action, we're not talking about incitement to offense. And that's where your Justice Minister and I differ. That if he can limit it to incitement to unlawful action, let's be specific, and he can prove that there's a causal link, then he's got me. But generally, when we're talking in terms of speech as the operative activity, it really is, again, messing with labels so you can get at language that your political constituency doesn't like.
Yeah.
And that minorities find offensive and should find offensive, and that we should oppose the in the public forum and in public discourse, we should oppose that kind of language being used. But to turn it into criminal activity, and my God, to turn it into a felony, which is what he's doing by saying 3 years or more in jail, is reminds me of what's going on in China, what's going on in Russia, and what's going on unhappily in some of the southern states and some of the Republican states in this country, is they're taking what would ordinarily be minor offenses, violation of the laws regarding demonstrations and so forth. And now what they're doing in some of the new statutes is pumping up the penalties into felony penalties. Russia, remember the three women that made up a rock band that did a rock performance in a church that was offensive to the church.
Yeah, cool. The band's called Pussy Riot, I think.
Yes, and they were sentenced to 3 years in jail. This is kind of what your Justice Minister is talking about. Ask him what he'd do about the Pussy Riot. Would he throw them in jail too?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I do look. I mean, until I hear otherwise, I'm going to err on the side of he misspoke and maybe the word offence just popped out. But then again, he also talked about the Human Rights Commission, and he said there's two ways that this new law will be enacted. One is obviously the like in a criminal setting, and the other is in a civil process. This is another direct quote. Now, if this gets to anyone and they say no, who didn't see that, then just go on to here in New Zealand. There's a TV channel called TV3. Go on to their on-demand service and look up Tova O'Brien's interview with the Justice Minister from last Saturday, and you'll see these quotes. He says them. I've written them out as he said them. It's verbatim. He talked of the civil process, saying, quote, "If you believe that someone has used hate speech, not necessarily to incite hatred, then you can go to the Human Rights Commission." So he actually said, if you want to take someone before the Human Rights Court, even if you think their hate speech hasn't incited hatred, then you've got the right to do that. And once again, I'm going to come back to what you said before about going to courts. Even the cost of going to courts, the time of going to courts, could be enough to squash people's speech. And that was one of the other things that made me, it kind of echoed a little bit of what's happening in Canada with speech laws and the Human Rights Commission. But that concerned me as well, that I could then take person X before the Human Rights Commission because basically they've offended me. He didn't use the word offended, but that's what it says to me.
Well, it strikes me that if you really focus in on the procedures now, that you have not only the criminal process, but a civil process, which we haven't done usually in the states with regard to speech, although we have done it in the states with regard to discrimination, race discrimination and the like. The problem is that the standards, when you move to the civil side, are much less protective of individual rights than they are on the criminal side. And the cost to the speaker is going to be very high, whether or not they are acquitted, basically, in the civil proceeding. The use of civil proceedings to regulate speech is it's a morass, and it's very dangerous in the long run. It will suppress a lot of speech.
Yeah, and we've got examples here in New Zealand of a particular. I was going to say he's a politician. He never actually made it into any kind of office. An attempted politician who, if he disagrees with what someone's going to say, he takes them to court. He's a very wealthy man. And of course, then people back down because they can't afford the $50,000, $60,000, $100,000 lawyers' bills that come with having to defend whatever they've said about this particular person. And it can certainly be a way to restrict and hamper free speech, and it's a concern.
It's going to may make the justice minister popular. It depends on kind of the temperament and the leanings of the voters these days.
Yeah.
It's a no-lose situation for him because all he ends up with is criticism in the press and on the editorial side, but there's no one that really, there's no constituency other than the press that really gets that has any power or any ability to fight back that exists. I mean, you're picking on little people with big mouths when you're using these laws for the most part. And if you've got a problem with a white nationalist group that's got to be dealt with, it seems to me what you do is look for unlawful activity on their part rather than trying to pick them off by saying, well, they've said these words and we're offended, or they've said these words and they've offended people in my constituency.
Yeah. Hey, David Goldberger, thank you for joining us today. You have had cases before your Supreme Court 4 times. You've argued in front of the Supreme Court. And I wonder, not to put you on the spot, but if you had Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, seeing this video, and they're going through the consultation process right now of what to do with hate speech and hate law, as I said, putting you on the spot, but off the top of your head, what advice would you give her and give our government around what we should be doing and looking at to protect freedom of expression, freedom of speech, but also to be able to put in place restrictions around hate speech that does incite violence?
Well, it seems to me that my advice is always to limit the reach of your laws to those things that are actually harmful to the society, and remember principle and put it ahead of political interest. Very good. I was going to have the problem with what you've just said is harmful to society. Straight away it becomes a relative term. And then we go to that question again, who decides what's harmful? Right. Well, to that extent, I'm talking about physical activity that really is palpably damaging in terms of the kinds of harms that the criminal process is really designed to protect against. And it should not be protecting against, the criminal process should not be protecting against dignitary harms. David, this has been amazing. I've enjoyed this so much. Thank you so much for coming and joining me for a crazy hour of chat early on a Thursday morning here in New Zealand. It was a pleasure. And all I can say is, I guess, even though your constitutional freedoms don't really impact us here in New Zealand per se, thank you for the work that you've done, and thank you for the example that you've set,
and the wisdom you've brought to various freedom of speeches, cases throughout America that do, I guess, there's an old adage that when America sneezes, the world catches a cold. So what you do within your courts does flow on to the rest of the world, either as example or as in case law to look back to. So, yeah, thank you for what you've done and what you did, and thank you for being with us.
I really appreciate it, although of late America's been doing a lot of sneezing, and I think a lot of places are catching cold.
All right, David, all the best.